Chapter 9. Genealogy as Critique. I should like to address the issue of genealogy as critique in terms of the question about the relationship between theory and praxis, between knowledge and its supposedly binding power. In the context of modern philosophy, we can distinguish at least three basic types of critique, which effectively correspond to three senses of the word critique itself. Footnote. The word critique derives etymologically from the Greek verb krinon, meaning to distinguish, separate, or divide. In the ancient world, the substantive critique was used in a very broad sense to designate a considerable range of cognitive abilities and accomplishments. Critique, in this sense, originally, therefore, signifies analysis, or the theoretical breaking down of a given phenomenon into its elements. End footnote. In an everyday sense, the term critique describes a specific form of conduct with two characteristic features, which I may adopt with some regard to someone or something. In the first place, the term, in this sense, possesses unambiguous negative connotations. I am not criticizing a specific position if I merely ask for further clarification, for example, or if I offer additional arguments for the relevant position, but only if I assume a negative stand towards the latter. In the second place, I cannot be said to criticize a certain position if all I do is simply repudiate or oppose it. In order to exercise criticism, I should also have to say what I am objecting to and why, i.e. to provide reasons for my repudiation. But demanding, proffering, and accepting reasons, or repudiating them, as the case may be, is a specific social language game, which may assume this or that particular form, and may be institutionalized with various degrees of strength. What counts as a valid reason or ground for something in a legal juridical context may be quite irrelevant to the context of a literary or philosophical discussion. In the language game of proffering grounds and reasons, the process of justification and critique usually function as reciprocally and internally related acts. They are, as it were, mirror images of each other. Justification implies the presentation of positive and convincing grounds and reasons. Critique implies the effective presentations of negative ones. Footnote. Apart from the developed language game of justification familiar in the legal juridical context, there is also the different but related usage encountered in aesthetic discussion. As a critic, I may review a play without coming to a negative verdict. I may find it excellent and lavish extravagant praise upon it, etc. My evaluation need not therefore be remotely negative, but it must, if it were to be taken seriously, be supported with reasons. The language game involved in demanding, proffering, and accepting reasons is rather differently structured in this area compared with the legal juridical context. For I may analyze the positive aesthetic characteristics and the weaknesses of the piece without actually coming to a straightforward, definitive conclusion like the piece is good/is bad. End footnote. For centuries, philosophers have attempted to generalize critique in this everyday sense. The development reached an initial accumulation in the Enlightenment, and most particularly in the philosophy of Kant. And this brings us to the second sense of the term critique. Kant speaks repeatedly of the tribunal of reason, before which all the conflicts of theoretical and practical reason alike are to be properly addressed. The juridical metaphor, the idea that the quest for authentic knowledge resembles a legal process of some kind, originally goes back to Plato and characteristically permeates the entire Kantian argument. As in the case of juridical procedure, the conclusion of this trial, aimed at discovering truth, is a verdict that claims binding force. Footnote. Kant, where the objectivity of knowledge is defined explicitly in relation to the idea of compulsion. End footnote. This kind of legal process conducted before the tribunal of reason is essentially understood as something that possesses universal and absolute validity and binding force. At the same time, critique for Kant signifies the investigation of the limits involved in the proper use of reason, and thus the self-legitimization of reason in its juridical function within the limits as so determined. Footnote. The judging function consists, remarkably enough, precisely in acting legislatively here. End footnote. One should not underestimate the significance of Kant's concept of systematicity for the entire structure of his theory. All experience is accompanied within a single system that is subject to the legitimate competence of the tribunal of reason itself. Footnote. This summary account ignores the fact that for Kant there are actually two different realms of validity involved and therefore two tribunals of reason as well. That of theoretical reason responsible for adjudicating empirical evidence in general, and of the natural sciences, and that concerned with pronouncing the moral verdict of pure practical reason. It is not possible to pursue this complex of issues in the present context, but in both cases we are presented with an internally unified and comprehensive realms of validity. End footnote. Critique in the first everyday sense is therefore a way of denying or saying no to something. For this reason, it is implausible to suggest that Foucault understood his own works as critical sciences in the everyday sense. We should rather assume that he intended to adopt the Nietzschean posture that finds expression in a remark from the gay science. Let looking away be my only negation, for I wish only, one day, simply to be a yes-sayer. But how can we really entertain general reservations about saying no? Is not this capacity so fundamental and indispensable that no objections to it could ever be ultimately convincing? However that might be, the most powerful objection is surely this. To deny or reject something, at least in certain contexts, is to participate in a language game of proffering and accepting reasons and grounds for negations or denial in a specific move in such a game. Footnote. There are also two other possible grounds for skepticism here. In the first place, one may raise objections to the negativity of this approach per se. One can thus claim that it is unattractive, fruitless, and exhausting to be purely negative because an exclusively negative response merely fetters human energies rather than releasing them. See Bideau. In the second place, there is a certain objections with characteristically Hegelian rather than Nietzschean overtones. Someone whose sole purpose is the negation of an existing given can easily become entirely fixated on the latter. Negation can render us dependent upon what is negated, and is therefore not always compatible with the pathos of total liberation from the experience of oppressive positivity. Since Foucault has little sympathy for the projects of radical liberation, it is rather improbable that objections of this sort carry any weight with him. End footnote. But what if one already harbors certain fundamental doubts concerning the language games of grounding, critique, and justification? What if one attempted to avoid or undermine them, or call them into question, or perhaps suspend them? Kant believed that there was nothing of relevance outside the competence of pure reason, that it was impossible to undermine reason itself by calling it into question, or more precisely, that the very attempt to do so would logically lead to the sort of transcendental reflection that reveals the absolute and universal validity of the rationality implied in science, morality, and the associated language game of grounding and justifying. But what if this Kantian claim itself were nothing but another example of dogmatism? Is there perhaps simply a historical variety of different games of justification that do not constitute a single unified system? How can I escape the jurisdiction of such processes of justification, or assume a position outside or beyond this realm? One possibility is the utopian activation of fantasy and imagination. If I compose some utopian novel or utopian piece of theater, then I do not necessarily have to get involved in a discussion of knowledge claims and their justification, etc. Aristophanes' plays The Birds is not a systematic or a scientific work, but a Nietzschean turning away from the contemporary reality of Athenian life. This is a way of thinking differently, though it is one whose practical implications are very hard to determine. Footnote. This is not equally the case with all of Aristophanes' comedies. Thus I presume that one would have to evaluate the relationship to praxis implicit in the works like the Arcanians, the Birds, and the Frogs in a different manner in each case. End footnote. There is a passage where Foucault speaks of the ethos of enlightenment and interprets it precisely as the questioning of all givens. To question something is naturally not necessarily to reject it. Foucault distinguishes this ethos very sharply from the Kantian attempt to define and determine an all-encompassing, self-grounding realm of legitimate competence for pure reason. While we can and should preserve the ethos of enlightenment, the program of transcendental grounding is obsolete and should therefore be abandoned. A comparison with The Husserlian phenomenology can help clarify the theoretical situation as I see it here. Simplifying matters considerably, we may distinguish two fundamental elements in phenomenology. In the first place, Husserl proposes, like Kant, that human experience forms an infinite but unified field for potential investigation, one which has the transcendental ego as its intrinsic correlate. In the second place, Husserl develops a method designed to encompass this field effectively in epistemic terms. The heart of the method is the so-called epoch, the systematic and universally applied procedure of bracketing, neutralizing, or suspending all reality claims in a specific domain precisely in order to facilitate the pure description of the phenomena that thereby remain for inspection. Foucault wants to reject the first element of Husserl's program entirely. There is no transcendental ego, nor is there any valid realm of pure reason capable in principle of encompassing the whole range of empirical experience in a unified fashion. But he does wish to preserve the second element, namely the epoch, in a modified form. He has no intention of introducing his epoch in a strictly universal fashion within the framework of an abstract philosophical investigation of the foundations of knowledge, but only intermittently and always in a limited context of a specifically defined project of historical investigation, although the word historical must be interpreted broadly enough to include the present in its purview as well. Footnote. The term historical signifies both A, singular in contrast to universal, and B, related to the past, and not the present. At the beginning of the Western tradition of historiography, in Herodotus, for example, the first sense is actually the principal one. The Greek word historia generally simply signifies research or inquiry into something. Thus, alongside investigations that are purely historical in the modern sense, the historiographical writings of Herodotus also contain geographical studies, ethnological materials, myths, fragments of a theological character, political observations, etc. In the following discussion, historical is understood in this broadly classical sense. End footnote. The impossibility of providing a self-grounded legitimation of reason in no way implies the nihilistic view of our own cognitive resources. Language games of justification are themselves various and contingently produced forms whose emergence and disappearance must be identified and traced historically. In no way does it follow from this that they are somehow invalid. What is more, the critical ethos of enlightenment, as it is understood by Foucault, is better seen as a tireless encouragement to go beyond the alleged limits of reason than as an attempt to somehow limit the exercise of the latter. And this also suggests another reason why any closure or systematicity in the Kantian or Husserlian sense is already ruled out as impossible. Art, and especially literature, can contribute to the enhancement and consolidation of this ethos, but the transgression of limits attempted in Foucault's work is also intended to raise a potentially cognitive claim. These reflections thus yield our third sense of critique. Critique as a way of putting into question or problematizing something. What does such a critical process look like concretely, and how does it effectively proceed? The principal targets of this problematizing approach are the apparently self-evident assumptions of a given form of life and the supposedly natural or inevitable and unchangeable characteristics of given identities. The existing language games of justification and legitimation are never entirely isolated and autonomously self-contained practices. On the contrary, they intersect with other language games. They perhaps harbor a certain potential for further reflection, and they are embedded in a broader sets of practices. The latter sometimes facilitate the process of critique, but not every potential for reflection that is given in principle is actually realized in every particular case. Footnote. One should not interpret reflection here in a narrow idealist sense of the term. Over and beyond the pure and exclusively self-related moment of spirit itself, reflection can also signify the revision of our accumulated modes of thought in the light of new attitudes to life and fresh empirical knowledge. End footnote. Any given language game of justification and legitimation rests upon a complex structure of practical habits and routines. The regulated exchange of argument and counterargument, of reasons for and against, proceed all more smoothly because the self-evident rules are tacitly observed by the participants, and the more the participants are acting in the context of well-established, pre-given, and apparently secure variables. Here I should like to offer a deliberately extreme example, and one that Foucault did not explicitly discuss in his own writings, that of an ecclesiastical court in the Middle Ages. The successful functioning of such a court presupposes a range of beliefs then regarded as self-evident, like the absolute truth of the Christian gospel and its saving message, and the necessary division of all human beings as Orthodox Christians, or proper Catholics, heretics, and pagans. The traditional philosophical discussion of Christianity, whether critical or apologetic, primarily investigates the truth of the Christian doctrine or potential justification of the Christian faith. These traditional investigations tacitly presuppose that something like Christianity already exists as a unified, internally coherent, given phenomenon that presents itself as an object for possible discussion. Genealogy is designed to render precisely this presupposition problematic. To offer a genealogy is to provide a historical dissolution of self-evident identities. If we remain with our example, it is to place in question both the identity of the ecclesiastical court and that of the parties presented before the court as sinners, for instance. The genealogy of Christianity is a historical analysis of the process through which Christianity resulted from an interplay of forces in time. Genealogical attention to the role played by contingent relations of power in the genesis of Christianity, including Christian dogma, for example, intrinsically serves to destroy the semblance of self-evidence and immediate givenness that attaches to it. A genealogy is obviously not a critique in the everyday sense mentioned above, that is to say, it does not automatically imply the rejection of what is subjected to genealogical analysis. Footnote. Some other remarks of Nietzsche seem particularly appropriate in this context. In Book 5 of The Gay Science, section 345, he writes, "These historians of morality, particularly the Englishmen, do not amount to much. Their usual mistaken premise is that they affirm some consensus among peoples, at least among tame peoples, concerning certain moral principles, and then conclude that these principles must be unconditionally binding also for you and me. Or conversely, they see that among different peoples moral valuations are necessarily different, and infer from that no morality is binding, both of which are equally childish." Nietzsche was therefore perfectly aware of the false step involved in what is generally called the genetic fallacy, and we can safely assume the same level of insight in Foucault too. End footnote. Genealogical critique is not directly concerned with the binding truth or falsity of a first-order claim or proposition. It is therefore not interested in knowing, for instance, whether Sinner George feels due contrition for his transgressions or not. To ask that question is to conceal the relevant genealogical question. What we want to know is, how do concepts like contrition, sin, punishment, and church come to be binding and universally applied to all? This is a question for which neither an empirically or hermeneutically oriented theory of knowledge nor any mere historical analysis of concepts can provide a relevant answer. The concept of sin relates perhaps to a clearly identifiable complex of modes of behavior and human reactions. It may be that George actually does feel sinful. Sin, therefore, possesses a certain fundamentum in re, which survives normal empirical critique. George may well be deceived in falsely believing that the ecclesiastical court will pardon him, but he is not deceived in the same sense when he feels himself to be a concrete sinner. This latter identity is constructed, but it is not purely imaginary. Sin and contrition can thus possess an eminently somatic reality, which cannot simply be dissolved into a variety of concepts, convictions, attitudes, and perspectives. The genealogical question asks, how has a specific historical process led human beings to develop and embody this sort of identity? Such a process is more than a series of episodes in which external forces shape the passive human being ab extra, for the emergence of a historically effective identity also requires certain processes through which human beings freely shape themselves. Footnote. Like Nietzsche, Foucault is firmly convinced that the concept of freedom and any actual ascription of freedom is always dependent on some specific context. End footnote. The genealogical task is directed towards narrating this history as completely as possible, that is to say, with due attention to as many of the relevant aspects as possible. Genealogy involves an indispensable historical element, but one may well ask why such genealogical inquiry demands fresh, historically detailed and specific analysis in each case. Why is it not sufficient simply to offer a single decisive abstract argument for theses like everything is contingent, there is no intrinsically necessary identity, everything self-evident requires a prior framework? To see why that is not enough, we must understand the internal relationship between genealogy and praxis correctly. As we have seen, genealogy is not conceived as critique in the everyday sense. It is not meant to encourage human beings to repudiate what is subjected to critique or even to regard it simply as a negative light. In a late interview, Foucault says he was concerned with claiming not that X is false or X is bad, but rather that X is dangerous. The dangerous is what we must preeminently concentrate attention upon, what we must before all else take care to consider. The dangerous can indeed be attractive or even valuable, but in cases of acute danger, the aforementioned Nietzschean attitude of looking away is not always the best strategy. Genealogy, as pursued by Foucault, on the other hand, is a way of concentrating attention on a given situation in the context of imminent danger. The discrimination of what is more dangerous from what is less demands detailed historical presentation of the specific case. Nietzsche speaks of the philosopher as lawgiver. Genealogy does not lay down the law, nor is it a policing discipline. Rather, it is a summons to develop an empirically informed kind of theoretical imagination under the conditions of a perceived danger. In contemporary philosophical discussion, the concept of normativity, along with the now almost automatically raised question concerning the normative implications of every theoretical proposal, is surely the most important self-evident notion that must be put in question. Foucault's work can be interpreted as an initial contribution to a genealogy of normativity, and his writings will remain highly relevant until such a time as the task is fulfilled.